March 1945. The West Wall of the Third Reich had crumbled. Across the European theater, the Allied war machine was operating with unstoppable momentum. And the name chanted most loudly was George S. Patton. To the American press, he was old blood and guts, the embodiment of victory. To the German soldier, he was a constant terror. And most dangerously of all, to himself, Patton began to believe he was invincible. But military history holds a ruthless forensic principle. When a general begins to believe his own myth, disaster strikes. On the night of March 26, 1945, at a forward command post, Patton issued an order that left his staff officers stunned. An order that ignored basic logistical principles, disregarded intelligence warnings, and most importantly, served no strategic objective for the United States Army. He ordered a solitary task force, stripped of all artillery or air support, to advance 60 miles deep into enemy territory. They were not going to seize a key strongpoint. They were going to rescue one man. Inside the Hammelburg prisoner of war camp was an American lieutenant colonel named John Waters, and this man was Patton's son-in-law. He wanted a Hollywood-style rescue. He received a meat grinder. 300 soldiers and 57 armored vehicles drove into the darkness that night. Not a single vehicle returned. Not a single prisoner was brought back to friendly lines. The strategic objective failed. The personal objective collapsed. The price paid was the blood of 300 loyal soldiers, men who placed absolute trust in their commander, only to be thrown into a mission that was entirely futile. Today, we will open the black box of the Hammelburg disaster. We will peel back the layer of myth to look at the naked truth of an event that should be called by its proper name, a case of strategic manslaughter. To understand why this tragedy occurred, we cannot start on that fateful night. We must return to the moment when Patton's confidence mutated into something far more dangerous: hubris. To dissect the mechanical cause of this accident, we cannot start when the vehicle went over the cliff. We must return to the moment the driver began to believe he could fly. And in the final days of March 1945, George S. Patton was not just driving his war machine, he was flying on clouds of absolute glory. If you open any Allied newspaper from that time, you will see a flawless saga. In less than 10 days, Patton's Third Army had swept the southern flank of the German forces with a speed that dizzied even the most optimistic strategists at the Pentagon. They had captured 60,000 POWs, destroyed 2 German armies, and seized the Saar-Palatinate region so fast that staff maps could not update the new positions in time. The peak of this euphoric state occurred on the night of March 22, while British Field Marshal Montgomery, Patton's greatest rival for fame, was meticulously preparing a massive Rhine crossing with artillery support and carpet bombing in the north. Patton stole the spotlight. He ordered the 5th Infantry Division to cross the Rhine in silence. No artillery, no route clearance. The result, a brilliant success. American troops set foot on the east bank of the Rhine, expending almost no ammunition. In that moment, Patton stood on a tactical pontoon bridge, looking down at the dark water considered the holy river of Nazi Germany. He stopped, leisurely unbuttoned his trousers, and urinated into the water below. It was an image of extreme symbolism. The American press went wild, hailing it as the defiance of freedom against tyranny. Staff officers saw in it the decisiveness of a military genius. The atmosphere at 3rd Army headquarters was thick with the scent of invincibility. They believed they had broken the Wehrmacht's spine. They believed that from this moment on, the war was merely a mopping up operation. That is what popular history records. A glorious chapter. A legendary general. But under the microscope of military forensics, this state of extreme euphoria is not a sign of sustainable strength. It is a clinical symptom of a dangerous command pathology, the delusion of invulnerability. When a system continuously wins through risky gambles, it begins to disregard safety protocols. It stops processing warning signals. It begins to believe that the laws of probability do not apply to it. At Oppenheim, Patton and his staff had fallen into exactly this state. They looked at the map not to find threats, but to find the next glory. It was in this sterile environment, void of dissent, that the seeds of disaster were sown. On the morning of March 23rd, a G2 intelligence report was placed on Patton's desk. The report confirmed the location of the O-Flag 13B prisoner camp near the town of Hammelburg. More importantly, it attached a list of high-profile prisoners, prominently featuring the name Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. John Waters, husband of Beatrice Patton, son-in-law of the general. At this moment, we witness the formation of a strategic blind spot. If it were any other POW camp, Patton would have processed the information according to standard procedure. Assign to reconnaissance, plan methodically, and wait for the main army. But the name Waters triggered a chemical reaction in Patton's brain, transforming him from an army commander into a father-in-law desperate to score a point. He looked at the Hammelburg position on the map. And right here, had he not been blinded by the aura of victory, he should have seen 3 red flags flashing violently. Red flag number 1, the lethal distance. Hammelburg lay 60 miles deep behind enemy lines. In mechanized warfare, sending a small, isolated unit that deep into enemy territory without a supply line, without infantry to hold the flanks, is technically a suicide mission. Basic military rules dictate a deep penetration force must be strong enough to defend itself 360 degrees, or fast enough to vanish. 60 miles of Spessart mountain roads is too far to run and too long to defend. But Patton, with excessive confidence, viewed this distance as merely a simple line on a map. He believed the Germans would part like the waters of the Rhine. Red flag number 2, enemy density. G2 intelligence provided clear data. Although the Germans were retreating, the Hammelburg area was not empty. To the contrary, it was becoming a rally point for the remnants of panzer divisions and tank destroyer units. The enemy had not vanished. They were backed into a corner and condensing. The density of anti-tank firepower in this area was increasing by the hour. Sending a small force into that is like poking a hand into a fire anthill. However, the symptom of confirmation bias caused Patton to dismiss these details. He saw only POW camp. His brain's filter automatically removed the symbols for enemy armor units. Red flag number 3, biological limits. The unit selected for the mission, the 4th Armored Division, was the elite spearhead. But the word elite was abused to cover a logistical reality. They had been fighting continuously without rest since crossing the Rhine. Medical and technical reports showed soldiers were exhausted and sleep-deprived. Vehicles were at their maintenance limits. They were human, not perpetual motion machines. Pushing a unit at its endurance limit into a mission requiring high alertness is a violation of personnel management principles. But Patton did not see the fatigue. He saw only a sharp tool, ready to be used for a private purpose. No one on the staff dared to say no decisively. Why would they? They were serving under the most successful general in American history. The silence of the staff, resonating with the glory of the Rhine crossing, created a perfect echo chamber. In there, every idea of Patton's, no matter how insane, was reflected back as genius. At this time, the soldiers of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, were still sleeping in cold tanks on the banks of the main river. They dreamed of the day the war would end. They did not know that a few miles away, in a warm room, their fate was being decided, not by the strategic needs of the nation, but by a sentimental gift a commander wished to give his family. All the necessary elements for a tragedy had converged. An overconfident general, a staff paralyzed by their superior's aura, intelligence warnings ignored, and an exhausted army pushed beyond its limit. The conditions for disaster were established. On March 23rd, Patton summoned Major General William Hoge, commander of the 4th Armored Division, and Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of Combat Command B. These were the elite armor officers of the U.S. Army, men who knew no fear, but knew how to calculate. But in that fateful meeting, Patton did not need their numbers. He needed their obedience. The order was issued coldly. Patton wanted a task force to detach immediately, punch through the German line, and go 60 miles east to Hammelburg to liberate the prison camp. Immediately, subordinate officers saw the red flags flashing on the tactical sand table. General Hoge and Colonel Abrams objected fiercely. Based on the military doctrine of deep penetration, for a unit to operate independently deep in enemy territory, it must have the minimum scale of a combat command. Thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, with artillery and air support. Only that scale could crush resistance along the route and protect the prisoner column upon return. If you send less, Hoge warned, it is a suicide mission. Here is where the glitch appears. Patton refused to commit the full force. His reasoning was that he did not want to reveal the main direction of attack. But forensically, this is a fatal logical contradiction. He wanted to execute the most dangerous mission, yet stripped away the safest tools. The result was a compromise of negligence. A small-scale task force was formed. The final count? 300 soldiers, 57 vehicles, including 10 Sherman medium tanks, 6 light tanks, and the remainder half-tracks and jeeps. Technically, this decision created a tactical monstrosity. The force was too weak to defend against an enemy division, yet too loud and bulky to execute a covert mission. It had no stealth capability, nor did it have suppression capability. It was a perfect mobile target. Look at the topographical map of the Spessart region and the Saale Valley to see the delusion of this plan. The 60-mile route they had to traverse was not a highway. These were narrow dirt roads, cutting through the dense Spessart forest and ancient towns with narrow bridges. This was a logistical nightmare. A Sherman tank consumes enormous amounts of fuel. With a 120-mile round trip, plus combat maneuvering, the fuel carried was insufficient. Patton's plan relied on the assumption that American troops would capture German fuel along the way. This is not strategy. This is a gamble, betting on whether the enemy's gas station is still operational. The man chosen to command this impossible mission was Captain Abraham Baum.
Baum was an excellent armor officer, seasoned in battle. He was young, energetic, and loyal. But in Patton's cold equation, Baum's talent was squandered. He was not considered a strategic asset, but an expendable one.
Upon receiving the order, Baum asked life or death questions, defining the isolation of his unit. Do I get artillery support? Answer: no. Do I get air support? Answer: no. Bad weather. Do I have a safe retreat route? The answer was silence.
Warnings from G2 intelligence regarding the German 7th Army massing in that area continued to be ignored. Patton believed Baum's speed would keep him alive. But speed cannot replace firepower when you are surrounded 360 degrees. On the evening of March 26th, Task Force Baum assembled at Aschenberg. Soldiers checked weapons and loaded shells into the Shermans. They did not know the true objective was the general's son-in-law. They only knew they were ordered to execute a rescue mission. Their bravery and discipline were being placed into a mechanism that was broken by design. When Baum's first tank rolled through the breach in the German line into the darkness, they left the safety zone of military logic. This force was overextended. The rubber band connecting them to safety was stretched to the point where it was certain to snap. Safety warning systems were disabled. Basic operational principles were discarded. Terrain and logistical data were swept aside. From the moment the tracks hit enemy soil, their outcome was no longer a question. When Task Force Baum punched through the German line at dawn on the 27th, Patton believed he had created chaos. He believed the appearance of American tanks deep in the rear would cause the Germans to panic, flee, and throw open the gates. That was a fatal misjudgment of enemy psychology. The German 7th Army, the unit responsible for this sector, did not panic. They did not flee. They observed. From observation posts on high hills and field communication stations, German officers looked down at Baum's column. They did not see an invading army. They saw prey. A solitary, arrogant, completely naked prey. Instead of fear, the German command's response was one of cold, technical curiosity. A situation report, SITREP, intercepted from the 11th Panzer Division, recorded this detached surprise. Enemy armored unit detected moving singly on main axis. No infantry support. No artillery support. Enemy air absent due to weather. Assessment. Enemy moving on suicide run or lost. Directive. Do not pursue. Close the door. The trap did not snap shut immediately. It was designed with ruthless patience. The Germans let Baum pass through the hard outer shell, letting him advance deeper into the pocket, where retreat became impossible. As soon as Baum's last vehicle passed the town of Schweinheim, the door closed. German combat engineers quietly blew the bridges behind the Americans. Tank destroyer units moved into blocking positions. The road home was cut. And then the execution began. It did not unfold as a major battle. It was a series of small, continuous, eroding ambushes. The Spessart forest terrain became Germany's greatest ally. From roadside bushes, from second-story windows of ancient houses, firepower rained down. The Germans did not need heavy tanks to confront Shermans. They used the Panzerfaust, a cheap, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that was lethally effective at close range. The destruction process unfolded like a technical exercise. A lead Sherman enters a curve. A dry crack. The track snaps. The turret jams. The vehicle burns, blocking the entire column on the single-lane road. American soldiers bail out, immediately falling into the crossfire of pre-positioned MG-42 machine guns.
There was no glory, only punishment.
Captain Baum tried to maintain speed. Speed was life. But with every mile advanced, his force grew thinner. A jeep burned. A fuel truck exploded. Wounded soldiers had to cling to the sides of tanks, becoming mobile meat shields. The Germans demonstrated terrifying discipline. They did not rush into a frontal attack. They picked apart the formation, separated the tanks, and isolated small groups. They knew Baum was running out of fuel. They knew Baum was tired. They just had to wait. By late afternoon, when the task force limped to the gates of Oflag 13B, they were no longer an attacking spearhead. They were a drifting shipwreck. The scene at the POW camp was the peak of the tragedy. Thousands of American prisoners rushed out, cheering, believing liberation had arrived. But the smiles vanished when they saw the condition of the rescuers. Baum had only half his tanks left. Fuel was critically low. Soldiers were exhausted, eyes sunken from stress.
Instead of taking prisoners home, Baum realized he had just put himself into the same cage with them.
Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, the objective of this entire insane operation, was shot and critically wounded by a German guard the moment the skirmish erupted at the camp. Patton's personal objective failed right at the finish line.
But the worst was yet to come.
That night, Baum ordered a retreat, but there was no road to retreat. The Germans had completed their encirclement deployment. Hetzer tank destroyers, small, low profile, hard to detect, were entrenched at key intersections. German artillery had dialed in coordinates for every trail.
Task Force Baum was driven onto Hill 427. Darkness fell, but brought no cover. German flares lit up the sky, turning night into day. And then the shelling began. No escape, no reinforcements, no miracle from the sky. The last Shermans fired back in desperation, barrels glowing red, until the last shell was spent.
Baum's command and control collapsed completely. Platoons lost contact. Tanks were isolated and destroyed one by one. Calls for help on the radio drowned in the shriek of artillery. At that moment, on Hill 427, there were no tactics, no formations, no rank. There remained only primal survival instinct inside a steel ring that had snapped shut. American control had vanished completely. When dawn broke over Hill 427, the guns fell silent. It was not the silence of peace, but the deadly silence of a battlefield that had completed its purge. The scene left behind a brutal forensic picture of collapse. Hours earlier, when Baum's final tanks limped to the gates of Oflag 13B, hope had flared for a moment. Thousands of gaunt American prisoners rushed the fence, believing a savior had arrived. But reality was far crueler. Baum arrived not as a liberator, but as a drowning man looking for a lifeline.
His force was spent, fuel was gone, ammunition was gone, and ironically, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, the sole reason 300 soldiers had to venture into this hell, was shot and critically wounded by a German guard right at the camp fence.
Immediately following was the chaotic retreat up Hill 427. Surrounded 360 degrees by numerically superior and heavily armed German units, Captain Baum, himself wounded, had to issue the most painful order of a soldier's life: every man for himself. That was the moment a military unit disintegrated. Discipline gave way to survival instinct. American soldiers discarded weapons, hid in the woods, trying to find a way home in vain. Most did not make it past 500 meters before being captured or cut down. Now, let us look at the butcher bill. Numbers do not lie, and the numbers of this incident are a damning indictment. Force involved: 300 soldiers, 57 vehicles. Equipment loss: 100%. All 57 tanks, jeeps, and trucks were burned or self-destructed by American troops. Not a single wheel returned to American lines. Human cost: 32 dead on the spot, 247 wounded or captured, including Commander Baum. Only about 35 soldiers were lucky enough to escape through the woods and return after weeks of hiding. Prisoners rescued: 0. In military language, this is not a standard defeat. This is a total debacle, a senseless waste of manpower and material. Patton's reaction afterward was a clumsy attempt at a cover-up. In reports sent to Eisenhower and press briefings, he tried to rebrand the mission as a feint attack to distract the Germans. That was a lie. A feint is never executed by throwing away an entire elite unit with no plan for retrieval. Eisenhower knew the truth, but he chose silence. He needed legendary General Patton to end the war, not manslaughter Patton. A thick fog of censorship was draped over the incident, turning a humiliating fiasco into a blurred anecdote. Today, with the distance of history and the transparency of data, we can deliver a final verdict. To assess the magnitude of Patton's error, we need only look at a single fact. 9 days after the bomb disaster, on April 6, 1945, the U.S. 14th Armored Division entered Hammelburg. They liberated O-Flag 13B methodically, safely, with overwhelming firepower and minimal casualties. 9 days. 300 soldiers of Task Force Baum were sacrificed simply because their commander could not wait 9 days. This renders their sacrifice futile. However, this verdict requires fairness. We are not here to denigrate the soldiers. Captain Baum and his men fought with extraordinary courage. They achieved the unthinkable with meager resources. They were not wrong. Their only fault was becoming pawns placed on the wrong square of the chessboard of vanity. They were lions led by blind ambition. George S. Patton was a military genius who made irreplaceable contributions to the Allied victory. That is undeniable. But history is fair in that it records both the light and the shadow. And in March 1945, at Hammelburg, Patton committed the greatest sin of a commander. He forgot the core principle. A soldier's life is the currency of war, and it may only be spent to buy victory, never to buy peace of mind for the commander himself. The myth may be written in ink, but the truth at Hammelburg was written in blood. And that is a price the families of the fallen have the right to never forget.